In this chapter, we will get to work on the application. By the end of this chapter, we will have applied Spring Security to our website and we'll have some kind of simple authentication in place. Before we get there, I'll take you through the project structure, how to run Tomcat, and how to redeploy. If you've been on a virtual pair programmers course before, then that might be a bit boring for you, but do stay with it because I'll also show you the Spring Security jars and how to configure them. That's going to take about 10 minutes, and then I'll talk about what Spring Security offers you that you won't find in the standard web.xml security. But then for the good stuff, we'll spend the rest of the chapter locking down one of the URLs in our application. We'll be working with lots of defaults, but this will enable us to get up and running quickly. In the Practicals and Code folder for this course, which you can download by clicking on the zip link on the course page, you'll find a workspace folder. And the contents of that folder is there's a project folder in there called MVC project. And as with all of our other courses, we want to keep things as simple as possible. So we have included a Tomcat folder. And our build process is going to build a WAR file, and the WAR file will be copied into that Tomcat folder. Now, of course, there are much better ways of doing this, but we have to be very careful to make sure that really everybody can do exactly the same steps without needing any special IDE plugins or anything like that. So I strongly recommend that you follow exactly the same pattern, and crucially you do need to make sure that the Tomcat folder is in the same folder as the project. Then in Eclipse, just off camera, I've opened up that workspace folder. I'll now create a new Java project with exactly the same name as the project folder you just saw. That's MVC project. And we should get a message saying that the wizard will automatically configure the project layout. And that's now opened up that project. This is the application that we built on the Spring MVC course quite a long time ago now. But everything we're going to do on this course would apply to any Spring MVC project. So if you have your own project, then you can probably use that too. I recommend you use this one just so you can follow exactly the same steps as on the video. And then of course you can transfer all your knowledge to your own projects. Now I have made one change to the project compared to the project we built on the Spring MVC course. And that's the lib folder. Inside here I've changed some of the jars. The MVC course was recorded on Spring 3, but since Spring 4 is at the time of recording the modern up-to-date version of Spring, I would much rather use that. So you can see here that I have various Spring jars and they're at version 4.1.6. But I've also added in there the jars for Spring Security. I'll talk about this in a short while, but Spring Security is a separate project to Spring. So it has its own versioning number, which is slightly confusing. You can see several Spring Security jar files here, and they all have the version number 4.0.2. Again, that is the current version at the time I recorded this. Now, of course, the recommended way to get Spring and Spring Security is to use Maven. But as always on a course, I don't know if you know Maven or if you even like Maven. So I like to keep things as simple as possible. If you do want to use Maven, then I've included a pom.xml file. You will only need this if you're planning on using Maven. Feel free to adapt this to your own requirements, but if I go down towards the dependency management section, the first thing to point out is I'm using here the new Bill of Materials feature in Maven. Now, I don't think I covered that in our Maven course. It's a feature that enables you to keep versions consistent. And I'm declaring here that anything that I download from the group ID of org.spring framework is going to be version 4.1.6. And that just means if I go a little further down to here, this is where I'm declaring the Spring Framework dependency. I don't have to include the version there. That's not that important. You don't have to use that if you don't want to. But the important bit for this course is here from line 95. These are my Spring Security dependencies. And something of interest for everybody is that Spring Security is split up into a series of modules. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different Maven artifacts that I've listed there. In fact, we don't need them all for the course. I'm not planning on doing any LDAP, at the very least in this module anyway, but I decided to include them all just for completeness. So that's if you're going to use Maven, but I still recommend, for simplicity on this course, that you use the predefined jar files that I've included in the lib directory. So the Spring Security jar files are all here. They're very easy to spot. I'll just very quickly go through the modules that we have here. Starting with the important one, the Spring Security core jar file is, as it suggests, the core features of Spring Security. And then I'll take the others in order. The ACL jar file is the access control list. This allows you to apply specific security settings to each of your domain objects in your code. So rather than just securing URLs on web pages, we can get very, very precise with our security authorization. The CAS jar file is a single sign-on jar file. We will be looking at those in future videos. And the config jar we're going to be using almost immediately in just a few moments. That defines the namespace for our XML configuration. LDAP is if you wish to use an LDAP repository for your authorization. I have no concrete plans to cover LDAP, but again, if that's something that's of burning importance to you, drop us a line at Virtual Pair Programmers and I will consider doing a module on that. We have OpenID, which is another single sign-on mechanism, and there is a taglibs jar file for JSP support, and we will be using that extensively. And similarly, there is a jar file, Spring Security Web, which has everything specific to the web, and we will be using that a lot in this section. So that's the project structure. We've supplied a Ant build script, which I get a lot of criticism for, but okay, no one likes Ant, but it shouldn't matter for this course. If you just right-click on the build.xml, run as Ant build, that should run the Ant build. And I'm hoping we never have to change the build.xml file. That will build a WAR file and copy it across to Tomcat. Before I go on, there is a common problem that happens here. If your compiler fails to run, it's because Eclipse can't find the Java compiler. And it really depends on the version of Eclipse you're using and quite a lot of other things that I don't quite understand. But if that does happen to you, then you just need to install a Java development kit from the Oracle website, if you haven't already, and then go to Window, Preferences, and then find the Installed JREs menu item. And you want to click on Add, select Standard VM, and then with this button here, find your Java development kit, which on Windows will be under Program Files and Java, and then find a JDK folder. And then when you've clicked on Finish, you can switch the checkbox across to the JDK folder. And because that contains a full suite of tools, then Ant should be able to find its compiler. To run the server, you will find inside the workspace folder. On Windows, you will need the start.tomcat.bat file, which you should be able to run. And you should see some logging with no obvious Java exceptions. If you're on Mac or Linux, then in a terminal window, navigate into the Tomcat folder and then the bin directory and just run as a shell script the startup.tomcat .sh file. Now that Tomcat's running and we've run a build, if you now visit the URL localhost:/mywebapp/view_allbooks.do, then that will run one of the controllers in your project. This controller happens to be the book management controller inside the control package. There isn't really anything interesting in there. It calls a Spring service and renders a model and view. I've had some criticism in the past for using this strange URL pattern ending in .do. I used that on the Spring MVC course just to make it absolutely clear that we're not visiting a static page here. We are running some Java logic. Of course, I could very easily have used a .html extension there, but it doesn't really matter for this course. So not very much to see here. We can add products to a shopping cart. We didn't bother styling all of the pages on that course. We can do a find by author, which is very exciting. And there's also a feature here to add a new book into the catalog. Here in the web folder are all of the publicly visible web files, HTML files and so on. There's a file here called header.jsp, which is the common header that you can see here. If I make any kind of a change, like just changing that to shopping cart, you do need to remember to rerun your build script. You can do that by using the icon in Eclipse here. But most important of all is once that build has run, it does take, I think every 2 seconds, Tomcat polls to see if that WAR file has changed. And when it has, then the console ticks over. It's just that that's a common problem when you're doing our course. If you deploy and then immediately jump into your browser and start clicking refresh, you might wonder why the changes haven't applied. Although be aware, on the videos, we will probably edit out the 2-second pause. So I don't want you to forget that that is necessary. Where possible on the videos, we'll put in some kind of a fade, or I'll very quickly flash up the Tomcat console just to remind you that it is important to wait for a redeploy. So we're going to be using Spring Security to do this, and I'll start with an overview of what Spring Security is all about. I'm here on the spring.io webpage, and the first thing to say is that Spring Security is not part of core Spring. It is one of these side projects, and these are a collection of projects which are closely related to the core Spring framework, and here it is right here. And we are going to be using the reference manual for Spring Security extensively on this course. I'm using the 4.0.2 version. The one here is a snapshot and isn't the current live version. So just find any of the current reference manuals and you will need to use this extensively. I have to say that I think this manual is really excellent, and I'm always honest on these courses. I think some of the reference manuals in the Spring set of projects are sometimes a little behind, but in general, I have found this manual to be really useful. Though Spring Security has a long history, it's been a side project of Spring for as long as I can remember, from the very early days of Spring. Although it was originally called ASCII Security for Spring. The name apparently came from the first 5 odd letters of the alphabet. And I really love that name because it was really easy to Google. You knew if you Google ASCII, you would find only information relevant to ASCII. But unfortunately, after a while, they changed their name to the much more bland sounding Spring Security. It's a little bit harder to Google and get absolutely accurate results, but well, I guess that's marketing. Now, if you don't know, the standard Java Servlet API already features a security mechanism, and it allows you to secure traditional websites. The standard security API, unfortunately, doesn't have any name. So that's perhaps why a lot of people don't know it's there. I call it standard web security, although it's sometimes called web.xml security. And that's because you can secure a website just by adding a few entries into the web.xml file. If you're not familiar with web.xml security, then I have produced a bonus video which you can find as an appendix chapter on this course. You don't have to watch it to understand Spring security, but some of you might find it useful. The thing about web.xml security is it's really simple, which is a strength, but it's a weakness as well. The web.xml security is so basic, it really only allows you to allocate URLs to roles, and that's it. If you want to do anything more sophisticated, then you're out of luck. But the big problem with web.xml security is that most of the work you have to do is not part of the standard, and it doesn't go into web.xml. It has to be configured on the application server you're running on. And this means that you have to do a lot of hard work to get your application running on, say, Tomcat. But then if you want to run the same application on Glassfish or JBoss or whatever, well, you have to get their reference manual out and start studying again. It's a bit more subtle than that, though. You might think, well, that's okay, I'm only ever going to use Tomcat. That's fine, but if you deploy your WAR file to one instance of Tomcat, and then later on you decide you need a new physical server with a new instance of Tomcat on it, then you're going to have to reconfigure all of your security settings on this new Tomcat instance. That's tedious and error-prone. With Spring Security, your entire security configuration ends up in your WAR file. And that means your security is completely server independent. I could drop this WAR file onto any application server, and the security settings will be exactly the same. And this is the killer feature of Spring Security. It's the number one reason that I use it on most of my live development projects. By the way, this is a little beyond the scope of this course, but remember that Spring Security is just a collection of jar files, and that means that you can perfectly well use Spring Security on a Java EE or EJB project as well. Just because you're not using the Spring core elsewhere, you can just use Spring Security. I won't dwell on that. I'm going to assume that we have a Spring project that we're securing, but I want you to be aware that it's possible. So that's the killer feature, the fact that your WAR file is completely portable. But the other big aspect really is that Spring Security is very rich. It has, out of the box, many of the big features that are considered best practice in security today. For example, one topic that I'm really looking forward to doing on this module is called bcrypt, and that is the correct way of storing passwords today. Now you can do this using standard web.xml security, but only by doing a lot of work on your application server. Here in Spring, you're going to get that almost for free with very minimal effort. Well, that's coming up later, but to get started, I would like to dive into Spring Security. And as quickly as possible, I would like to be able to just lock down this page here, the Add New Book page. I want that to be accessible only to administrators. So, how do we do that? Well, on this course, we're going to configure all of our security using an XML file. Now, I realize that we are in a controversial area here. Over the last few years, there has been a lot of criticism leveled at Spring for the amount of XML that you have to write. Now, I think that's quite unfair. In the very early days of Spring, yeah, you had to write far too much XML. But over the years, the amount of XML necessary has been really drastically reduced. And my feeling is that these days, the amount of XML you have to write is just about perfect. It's the important configuration aspects that end up in your XML. But in response to the criticism, Spring have gone really all the way, and they now give you the possibility to remove all of the XML from your Spring configuration. The feature is called Java configuration, and the idea is you write a Java class, and that contains all of the wiring for your project. And it's just regular Java code. Now, we've never covered that at Virtual Pair Programmers, and the reason, I'll be honest here, is that I hate it. I really think that Java code is not a good place to store system-wide system configuration. Now, it's a very debatable point, and it's just a personal preference, really, but I want to use the XML on this course. Having said that, if you check the Spring Security Reference Manual, you will find that almost immediately, here we are just in Chapter 3, which is where they really start to show you how to use Spring Security. They really lead on Java configuration. And it's clear that now the Spring people, the people behind Spring, really want you to use Java configuration. So I realize that I'm sort of swimming against the tide here, and a few of our customers have started asking for Java configuration. So I promise that we are going to do a Java configuration module very shortly at Virtual Pair Programmers. But I hope you don't mind me using XML for this course. All of the concepts that we're going to cover transfer really easily across to Java configuration. So I hope you're not too angry about that. In the starting project that I've given you, I have given you a pre-written file called securityconfig.xml. There's nothing special in here at all. I could have called the file anything I want, but what I have given you here is the dull and routine namespace section. Now, as you know Spring already, I'll assume you understand what's going on here. This is the mechanism that Spring uses to give us some high-level tags. And these tags will give us powerful configuration items with the minimal amount of XML. This is the namespace that you need for Spring Security, and the schema location is here. But I am doing a little trick here. I'm making the security namespace be the default namespace for this XML file. So in fact, every single tag that I use in here, Spring will assume that the tag is from the security namespace. And that makes sense because most of what I do in here is going to be security related. If, however, in here I want to, say, declare a bean, a standard traditional bean, then we will have to make sure, and I'm getting an error in my XML editor here, I will have to make sure that I qualify that by saying that that is from the beans namespace. Now I think on every single XML file I've ever done on our courses, the beans namespace has been the default namespace, but it won't be for this file, so just be aware of that. So let's get rid of that. So this file is going to contain all of the security configuration for our web application. Now you need to have this in the webin folder. So if you could just drag that into webinf, that's so that the file will remain completely hidden when we deploy it to our server. Now, in the old days of Spring Security, going back to the Asigi days, you had to write pretty much hundreds of lines of XML to make the security system work. At the time, that felt like quite a good thing because Spring Security is highly configurable. You can change pretty much every moving part of Spring Security and tailor it for your own needs. Whilst that's good when you're getting advanced, the problem is if you're just doing something simple and basic like we are at first, it was incredibly tedious to do the work. But wonderfully now with this new security namespace, it's a pretty simple job to apply a basic security configuration. And in fact, rather than going to a caption, if you're following along with me, I'm going to get our site secured in just a few lines of XML. The first tag we're going to include in here is the HTTP tag. This is a pre-written Spring Security tag that allows me to define the security constraints that I want to apply to the URL patterns that are appearing in the browser. And what I can do in here is I can include a tag which is the intercept URL tag. And this will tell Spring Security that whatever URL I include in here, I would like it to jump in and intercept that request and check that the user is authorized to actually visit that URL. So going back to our website, the URL that we're securing is the addNewBook.do URL. So it's a simple case of adding addNewBook.do into that pattern. Notice here that I am using a / at the beginning of that URL. That is required. It relates to the context root. So the application that I'm developing is called My Web App. We don't need any of that in any of our URL patterns. That's always ignored. We always start from the end of the context root. So we're addNewBook.do, but we could have subfolders and so on after the context root. So as well as the pattern, we also need to specify in here who is going to be allowed to access this resource. As we're starting with role-based security, we just need to decide what role is going to be allowed to access this resource. We define the roles ourselves, we can make them up, but we're going to have user roles and admin roles. So the syntax for doing this is a little bit complicated. We say access equals, and then in the quote marks we say has role, and then in round brackets and a single quote mark this time, we supply the role that is going to be allowed to access this particular resource. It's quite common in Spring Security to denote roles as role underscore followed by some label. But that's very flexible and very configurable. When we go a little further in the course, we will have a look at the inner workings of what's going on here. But for now, just treat this as boilerplate text that says that the user must have the role of role admin in order to access this resource. Okay, we need to tell Spring Security how we want the users to be logging on. In the next chapter, we're going to be building a form, a traditional form that will allow the user to enter their username and password. But a bit quicker than that, we can include a tag here which is HTTP basic, and there are in fact no fields to add in there. It's just a single tag. And that tells Spring Security that we want to use basic authentication. I don't know if you're familiar with basic authentication. It just means that the browser is going to be responsible for gathering the username and password. Now, we wouldn't use HTTP basic generally for a web application because the basic authentication box that we're going to see is going to be very ugly and basic. Yeah, literally basic. We won't have any control over its styling or anything like that. But it's a good way of getting up and running as quickly as possible. And in fact, in the next module, when we use Spring Security for web services, basic authentication is really good for web services. In terms of Spring configuration, that's all there is to do to get a basic configuration for your security system. Of course, we're going to be going a lot further than that on the course, but if all you want is simple stuff, then what I like about this is that the configuration is simple. Now, before this works, we do have a little bit of plumbing work to do. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that. We do need to do some work on the web.xml file. Now, I've decided on this course, rather than giving you a caption and getting you to type all of this in, it's quite tedious, really. It's largely boilerplate code. So I've given you a file in your project area called finalweb.xml. And all I'd like you to do is to delete the existing web.xml, which has the configuration of the dispatcher servlet, and we'll rename the final web.xml using refactor and rename to web.xml. And then if you open it up, I'll take you through the changes that have been made. And I really promise you, there's nothing exciting in here at all. We have here the standard dispatcher servlet configuration, which I hope you're familiar with from Spring MVC. But there is a change here down at line 19. Now, I didn't cover this on the Spring MVC course, and I'm not entirely sure why. I guess it's just one of those things that got missed along the way. But it's common practice to use this listener called Context Loader Listener from the Spring framework. And the idea of this is, rather than having to combine your XML files together, the Context Loader Listener can automatically load up all of your XML fragment files. So in our project, if we have a look at the dispatcher servlet.xml, up until now, what I've been doing is quite ugly, really. Here on line 25, I have been doing an import of the application.xml file. And that application.xml contains all of the business tier of my application, the database configuration and transaction management and services and all that kind of thing. And that means that all of the beans in there are visible to the dispatcher servlet. But using this listener, which is much more elegant, we don't need to do that anymore. So you will need to delete line 25 of the dispatcher servlet. And I think that's more elegant because now dispatcher servlet.xml only contains the beans that are relevant to the web tier of the application. This context loader listener is now given a parameter, which is the context config location. And this will automatically load in all of the other XML files, the application.xml, but now, and crucially, it will also load in our new security config.xml file. Now, I think this is a better way of doing things anyway, but it is necessary because you have to use a context loader listener to load in your security config.xml file. The dispatcher servlet.xml, by the way, will automatically be loaded by the dispatcher servlet up here. So I hope that's okay. The point of doing that is we have one further block of configuration down here. This is a filter. I don't know if you're familiar with filters from the standard servlet API. A filter is very much like an AOP class in Spring. A filter, and in this case the filter is called the delegating filter proxy, can be configured to automatically run every time a user accesses a particular URL pattern. And what's happening here is, well, for now, I would just like you to think of this as being Spring security. So with the filter mapping here, we're saying that all URLs, regardless of what they are going to be intercepted by this delegating filter proxy, so Spring security can apply its logic. Now, I know that we're only securing just at the moment one page, but you don't put just the one page in there. You want your entire site to be picked up by this filter. And that's because once it's picked up by this filter, then effectively the rules defined in here will kick in. So as we go ahead and add further files, further URL patterns later on, then we won't have to go fiddling around in the web.xml file. So actually, I hope that for the entirety of this course, we are never going to have to look at the web.xml again. So I'm going to close that now. I know that was a little bit tedious, but the thing to focus on is here. Well, let's see what happens if we deploy it. As we've made some big configuration changes, definitely check the output in your Tomcat log, because I suspect we are going to get an exception, and we have. I'll just focus in on here. It's saying that this has been caused by no such bean definition exception, and it's saying, if I can pick through this, that we have forgotten to add a Authentication Manager to our configuration. And this is a really good thing. I wanted that to happen to prove that we were picking up our new XML file. So that's actually perfect, but let's go back to the security config and I'll explain what's happening. It's not enough just to say that this resource here, for example, can only be accessed by users in the role of admin. We actually need to define a way for Spring Security to work out who the user is. In other words, we have to tell Spring Security how to do authentication. And we do that by providing an authentication manager. This is very simple as well. We use the tag called Authentication Manager from the security namespace. And inside, there's only one tag, which is Authentication Provider. Now, when we go a little further with our Spring Security, we'll be adding in here quite sophisticated methods of authenticating our users. But what we can do for testing purposes, just to get up and running, is we can hard code in here some existing users and roles. Of course, it's only for testing. We start here with the tag user service, and this allows us to define an in-memory database of usernames, passwords, and roles. We just add entries in here with the tag user, and we say the name of the user. So I'm going to be logging in as RAC, my initials. I need a password. Now, of course, this is going to be in plain text, and this is a completely insecure way of doing things, but I'm just going to use a stock password there. And then we have the authorities tag, and this enables me to specify which roles this user belongs to. So I'm going to say that the user called RAC is in the role of role_user, and this is a comma separated list. I'm also going to say that they are in the role of role_admin. And that's it. I can now go ahead and add some other users. So we're going to have a user called Joe. Their password will be, let's go for something even worse than secret. We'll go for password. But their authorities are going to be role user only. If you're really horrified at this stage, of course, before long, these are going to be in a database and they're going to be securely hashed. Really what we've done with this block here is we've defined the authorization rules, and here we've defined the authentication rules. And this time, I think we should be able to deploy to Tomcat without any exceptions. Let's see what happens. Now, the logging config on this project isn't perfect at the moment. In fact, we won't get any kind of output saying that the application has been successfully deployed. The thing you're looking for here are no exceptions, and that certainly was the case for me. The exception up here was from our previous deployment when we didn't have the authentication manager. So this looks pretty good. If you have an exception here, then almost certainly it would be some kind of typo in your security config, and definitely make sure that in Dispatcher Servlet you're not doing any imports and that your web.xml file matches exactly what I have here. If it's working, then we can test it out. We should be able to go to the All Books link, and we can. Shopping cart, well, it doesn't look very nice, but we can get there. Find by author is working okay. But now for the moment of truth, for add new book. Wonderful. We are getting the standard stock browser authentication required box. So I can try to log in here. Let's put in a nonsense username and a nonsense password, and we're refused. I'll try RAC and a bad password. Now I'm going to try our other user. This is Joe, and the password was password. And this will be different. Joe is able to log in, but they're getting a HTTP 403, simply saying that, okay, well, I know who you are now, but you're denied access to this resource because you're not an administrator. Now, slight problem, I haven't yet defined a logout button. So without a logout button, I'm now a bit trapped because if I go to add new book, I'm just going to keep getting back 403. So whatever we do now, we're stuck as the user Joe. And it turns out that with basic authentication isn't really designed to support logouts. What will happen now, even if I do a redeploy, which will expire the session, the browser still has the user Joe's credentials, and even now I'm in a completely new session. If I try to add new book again, the browser is still sending Joe's credentials across, and it really isn't easy to log out using basic authentication. There are a few hacks, but none of them are very nice. It's not a problem for us really, because we don't really want basic authentication for this system. We want form-based authentication. Now we'll be going into detail about how to do form authentication in the next chapter. But for this chapter, we can do a very quick fix, which is if we just take out the basic auth and replace it with the tag form login. That's just the opposite of basic authentication. We're now using form authentication. And what we can also do, which is very neat, if we include the logout tag, Spring will automatically generate a URL, which will be just /logout, and that will automatically log the user out. Now what I can do in here is specify a further attribute, which is the logout success URL. And that tells Spring Security where to go to once we've visited this logout URL. So we could divert back to the /view allbooks.do page, taking us back effectively to the home page. Now it would be nice if we could have a link to this logout. So if you find in the web folder the header.jsp, we can just include a link into there, ahref, and the URL is just logout. That's the default one generated by Spring Security. Now notice this is a little bit awkward. I have not included a / in there because this is just standard HTML. And if I put a / in there, it won't include the context root in the URL. In fact, really, I ought to be using the JSTL tag, similar to what I'm doing here. I'm guessing you're familiar with the JSTL tag C:URL. The idea behind that is that generates a URL and will carefully include the context root if there is one. So be careful with doing that. I've just kind of copied and pasted from viewcart.do. And it's a bit awkward with all these single quotes and double quotes and so on, but just compare that with the viewcart.do page and you should be okay. Before we deploy this, there is one further setting that we need to make in securityconfig.xml. Otherwise, this logout link just doesn't work. In Spring Security 4 and onwards, by default and automatically, there is a defense mechanism against something called cross-site request forgeries. A cross-site request forgery, otherwise known as CSRF, is a common attack that can be made against websites, and Spring features a clever way to prevent this. Until recently, you had to switch this protection feature on. But now, I think it's from Spring 4 onwards, it is on by default. Now that's great, and we are going to cover that later in the course in detail. But it's far too early to talk about this now, so I was hoping we could just ignore CSRF temporarily. But alas, it turns out that it's not possible to do a logout using this simple link if CSRF protection is on. It's not complicated. You just have to do a HTTP post in order to log out with the protection on. So although I promise we are going to talk about what CSRF protection is all about, for now I just want this simple logout link to work. So we're going to switch CSRF protection off and we'll bring it back later on. And we do this very simply with one extra tag. It is just the CSRF tag, and we'll be using one property, and that's the disabled. And we're going to set that to true. Notice that according to the comments here, now annoyingly, I can't quite fit this comment on camera, but it is telling us that the default is false. In other words, CSRF protection is enabled. We need now to set that to disabled equals true. That's all we've got to do. I guess the reasoning behind this is that Spring thinks that, well, you probably should have this switched on by default, and only if you really don't want it, you should switch it off. We'll come back to this later, but I think that's all we need to do now. We should be able to redeploy. And now we can rerun our tests. So there's all our books. We can visit the shopping cart and find by author, that's good. If I try to add a new book, nonsense username and password, we're locked out. I will use our user called Joe, and their password was password. Now this is good, as before, they're logged in, but their access is denied to that resource. And I think I've mentioned that in real life, we would have a nice looking 403 page defined. We don't need to go that far here. The fact that it's working is enough. If I go back to the all books page, again, if I go to add new book, yeah, I'm still logged in as Joe, so I can't get there. But I hope now I should be able to log out. So just check the URL at the bottom of the page. That's correctly rendering as /logout. And if I click that, now that's probably not that clear, but just clicking that link there has re-rendered this page. And remember, the success page was going to be the view all books page. I'll just prove that by going to a different page and clicking log out again. And yeah, I'm being taken back to the all books page. But the point of that now is if I go to add new book again, we're getting the challenge. And finally, I'm sorry, it did take quite a while to get here, but I'll try to log in as RAC with a bad password. No luck. And now finally, I'll log in as RAC and secret. And we finally have the form. So I hope that's all straightforward. We have done some fairly simple configuration here of authentication and authorization. We've clearly got quite a long way to go, but I really like this because I know I've mentioned that in the old days we had to do an enormous amount of configuration just to get to this point. So we've got a really nice base to work on, and in the next few chapters we'll build this up. So I hope you're at the same point as me. We're using a lot of the defaults right now in Spring Security. We're relying on a lot of automatic wiring from those tags. As we go further, not just in this module, but in future modules, we'll be digging deeper and seeing a lot of the inner workings of Spring Security. But for many purposes, the defaults can satisfy lots of requirements. The login form that we're using right now is supplied by Spring Security, and it's not intended for real use. So in the next chapter, we'll upgrade the form to make it integrate with our application.